We are glad to join Dr. Simon Ducatez from the French Institute for Sustainable Development in French Polynesia for our last Meet the PI session. So Simon is going to present his work during the next session, but to be brief here, he's a behavioral ecologist investigating the role of behavior in shaping animal responses to environmental change. While we chat with Simon, anyone listening to the stream can ask questions in the chat. So Simon, first of all, thank you for agreeing for this little interview. I can start with a question here. Simon, so my first question will be, you are a young PI. What did you find easy or hard to start with, like your own research? Was it easy, was it hard, and why?
You mean as I started as a PI here in French Polynesia?
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess the easy part is that I suddenly did not need to worry so much about finding funding for my next position, so I could really focus on my research entirely. So that was clearly the big advantage, of course, of being a PI. That really removed a lot of stress out of my way of conducting research, and I could focus on long-term projects. What was harder is that, in contrast, I was in charge of finding funding from pretty much anything I was going to do. So it really put the pressure on to find money. I was not joining a lab that already had this funding. I had to start a whole new lab here. And one reason I moved here to French Polynesia was also that there's very little research being conducted here on the territory directly. So the challenge was to start projects here in an area where there's not so many projects being like happening, especially in terrestrial ecology. So the challenge was there. So both pros and cons, I guess.
Oh yeah, I guess. And about the grants, like how long do you spend time writing grants, like in general?
Yeah, that varies substantially. It took me a lot of time. So I've been here for 3.5 years now. And I would say the first 2.5 years, it's been a very important part of my time. Like I spent a lot of time writing grants. Maybe I would say somewhere between 25% and 1/3 of my time, really entirely focused on that. So the rest of the time being mostly field work, actually, and not much time to write papers. But it's been a bit easier recently, mostly because I just realized that I was just spending too much time writing grants and I should focus on doing the research. I was kind of losing the interest in my job by just looking at money, basically. So that's something that's changed now recently, but also because we got some funding that makes it easier as well at some point to decide to stop looking for grants. Yeah, so it varies, I suppose. But at the beginning as a PI, yeah, I spent a lot of time really writing grants.
And because you are a young PI too, like, do you had to deal with lots of rejection at the beginning because you are young and it's a new field, you are starting a new project, so you don't have a lot of data to present in the writing. So how was it?
No, it's a good question. Actually, we've been very lucky here. I think because there's a lot at stake in terms of conservation. And also because we have, I mean, I hope I'll convince you of that with the presentation I'm going to give next, but we have a great experimental system in situ. So I think we were very lucky with getting funding. So not many rejection. We had one big rejection last year, which was for a project I spent a long time working on. Otherwise, we've been pretty lucky. But I think it's really, a lot of it is because there's a big biodiversity crisis, as you are well aware, and it's affecting islands especially more than anywhere else. And here in French Polynesia, there's so little research being conducted around these issues that we were very likely to get funding if we wanted some, I think.
Brian, you have a question, I think?
Yes, so that's really interesting to hear. I'm interested more to know about like what are the challenges of starting a new lab other than obviously funding. That was one resource, and you have obviously successfully went around it. So what are like other big challenges? Because obviously French Polynesia, we don't hear too much about like research conducted from those kind of areas. So and also like it's not like connected to mainland any like big I should say continent or like a big country from where you can easily get resources. uh, so like what are like other challenges of like starting a new lab from the scratch?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So the first challenge for me is that I'd never worked in French Polynesia before, and I've never been based in such a remote area. I've done a lot of field work in remote areas before, but so you plan your field work months ahead, and you get everything you need when you go on your mission. Here in Tahiti, we're very remote, so you really need to plan ahead, not just for your field work, but for anything. So if you're missing a chemical for your experiment, it may take 6 months for it to be delivered. So you really need to be well aware of that and plan everything a long time ahead. So that was one challenge initially. I just arrived and I could not really start much stuff except for very basic observations in the field. The other aspect that was challenging to me to start the lab here is that, as I was mentioning, there's very few people working in terrestrial ecology. And so we are hosted by the University of French Polynesia, but at this university, there's very little space to conduct experiment. We have a very small lab with little equipment, for example. So I have lots of colleagues that are working on very different questions in aquaculture or in geography. They're very diverse colleagues in terms of the discipline they're working in, the type of research that they're conducting, but very few that are working on similar questions and I need similar gear that I would need or that have similar facilities. I was used to having areas where you can just build aviaries on the campus where you have already aviaries that are available, for example, or you have a good facility to put aquariums or things like that. Here, that's not something we have, basically because that area of research was not really present on the territory before. So we kind of had to figure out how to deal with that and conduct research without these being available.
Yeah, I mean, that was something really interesting that you mentioned, like the limited space and like people have to collaborate or like the available resources, you have to kind of make sure that you are also using them. Because a lot of this research from like, for example, Tahiti, like I had a graduate senior who was doing like research in Vanuatu, but a lot of times it's like people who are doing research in those areas, they're like traveling there and like just so traveling there doing research for a few field season, for example, but they are based in like a much bigger area. So like uh so how do you like work around like these collaborations or um like again, like if you want to share some your research findings, obviously I don't think that there are many like conferences that happen nearby, so like you have to travel probably much farther than us. So like how do you get around those things?
Yeah, so one aspect we're really happy with that there's no field station connected to the university, but we're working with an NGO that's working on an atoll not far from Tahiti where they have a research station. And so that research station is very popular with international researchers as well. So that's a place where I'm working a lot. And we have these teams that are coming from all around the world, specialized in, seabird or the coral or vegetation or primary productivity, many different thematics. And so that's a great opportunity to interact with them and start collaboration. It's a different way of working in that instead of collaborating, usually I'm used to having collaborators that just work on very similar thematics, but maybe have a skill that I don't have, better at statistics or better at providing data or things like that. Here, we all working on the same site, and we realize that people working in the marine environment have things to teach us about what's going on the atoll. And similarly, we have interesting information on what's going on in the terrestrial environment that may influence what they're finding in the lagoon. So these are really interesting, different way of collaborating. The other aspect that these people you're mentioning, most of them are coming for very short missions, but it's really expensive for them to come here from the US or from the UK, etc. But we are there, we're the locals, so we have a chance to be in the field way more and to provide more more long-term data and more detailed data on what's going on in the field. But they're coming with a funding from big universities in the US, for example. And in contrast, they will just be there for a few weeks, but they'll be able to have very expensive analysis done on their samples, like genomics and stuff like that, that we would not be able to afford here. So it's really complementary in the end, what we can do with these teams.
Thank you. I think, Thang, you have a question?
Yeah, I think you just mentioned about the funding. I think you are now in the very special places. So how your funding agency look like, whether it's in France and Europe or also in Australia and New Zealand that you can apply for, because yeah, you are considered part of Oceania, but I'm not sure how is it for your application? Whether you can
Yeah.
target on or just only part of the Europe?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we definitely have access to these funding that are available to France. So one of our key funder at the moment is the ANR, so the French Research Funding Agency. But we also have access to potentially we could apply for European funding. And there is some local grants, like from the local government in French Polynesia is providing money. We have one PhD student that's funded by the Polynesian government, for example. One funding source that I was not considering in the past and that we are looking way more at is more applied research and applied conservation funder, the French Agency for Biodiversity, the OFB. Which is providing funding for restoration project, especially within this framework of we need to protect and restore that percentage of the area of the globe by 2030. So they're funding projects, including here in French Polynesia, and they're really happy to have some science happening in around these projects. So that's been an important source of funding as well for some of the projects we're running. Yeah, but it's pretty diverse. Yeah.
I see.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question for you. So, about your research in Polynesia, since you are quite new also to this position, was it like, how is it to do research based in Polynesia? So you mentioned the difficulty of working together with the others because you didn't know each other before. But when you start, how would you have advice to start collaboration with other people you don't know because you just arrive in a place you know no one? Would you have advice for other people that would do this after you?
Wow, that's a tough question actually, because I'm not sure that solved it yet. Yeah, so we have that unusual system in France as compared to say the English or the American system where we're working by teams of researchers, or teams of PIs that we're just usually in France you have these UMR system where researchers from the same thematics, potentially coming from different research institutes or universities, are put together to work and develop projects together. Here in French Polynesia, we also have that structure, but rather than putting together researchers working on the same thematic, it's mostly putting all the researchers that are on the territory together so that we have one structure, one administration, and we also can try to figure out what are the priorities for research on the territory. Because there's a lot of that here because we're so few, we don't have as much, we really have a few questions that really need to be addressed because they are really important for the territory. So we really try to identify these by interacting with the politics, with the NGOs, with the private sector, and then initiate projects in these areas. So some of my colleagues are really only mostly focusing on projects that are funded by the agency that's focusing on the marine resources, for example, to understand how the fish stock is doing and how aquaculture issues can be solved, like that. So there's that aspect where we're developing collaboration between colleagues that are working on very different questions. So for now, for example, we're working with chemists that are working on that plant chemistry, which are it's very new for me. It's the type of collaboration I hadn't really looked for before. So the way we're developing this collaboration, instead of having, a timeline, this is my research objective, that's what I want to find and figure out, and I'm going to find a collaborator to work on that. We're getting together to understand what projects are really important and what each researchers can bring into this project. So it's a very different logic, which I think is very interesting. It's very challenging as well, because I don't understand what the chemists are doing, and they don't understand what I'm doing. So we need to talk a lot and to figure out what are the issues, what can be solved, etc. So it's really interesting.
I guess you use a lot of Zoom meetings to do this, right?
Yeah, well, we're in person here as well. We're all based in Tahiti usually. This group of research.
And how is it every day? Because like it's French Polynesia, it's a lot of little island everywhere. So basically, how you meet each other in Tahiti, but when you have to move, how you do like to work or for conferences, how you do this? Like, is it easy to?
No, it's not that easy. Well, most of the population is based on the island of Tahiti. So there's about 300,000 people living in French Polynesia, a bit less than that. And 2/3 of them are on the main island of Tahiti. So most of the research facilities are here as well. This is where the university is. There is another lab on the neighbor island of Moorea, a big lab in marine biology, the CRIOB, with which we have quite a few interactions as well. But otherwise, the rest of French Polynesia, you have like about 120 islands. Most of them are either uninhabited or have very few people. But these tend to be the areas where we go to do field work. Well, we also do field work in Tahiti. And so that entailed a lot of transport, of course. Whenever possible, we try to go there by boat to try to mitigate our carbon prints. There's one field site where we go a lot, and about which I'm going to talk a lot about during my plenary later. And there we have the chance that there is a direct ferry boat 3 times a week that goes there from Tahiti, so it's relatively easy to go there. But in many other areas, you have sometimes just one plane once a week, so you have to stay in your field site for at least a week as well. So that can be a bit of a challenge. The remoteness of these sites is clearly one of the challenges. For conferences, we definitely are very happy to have these online conferences. That's super helpful. That's a great initiative, I think. So yeah, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Conferences, yeah, well, yeah, thanks again. We try to do conferences as much as we can. A lot of it is because we are very isolated, scientifically speaking, as well. Even though I have all these colleagues working in chemistry, working on aquaculture, etc., they are working on very different questions. So it's very interesting to work with them. But I also really miss having, evolutionary biologists around and having people with whom I can talk about animal behavior and understand what's being done in other areas. So when there is a conference that's not too far, say recently there was a conference in Australia, which still is pretty far, but is closer than going to Europe, for example. So then we don't let that pass. We don't let that chance pass. Fail.
Oh, so Per Brian, you have a question?
I mean, we are so far mostly talking about challenges. Would you like to talk more about what are the advantages or good things of doing research there? Obviously, it's a unexplored area. But other than that, what are the good things that you probably won't be able to do and maybe motivate some people to do research in like such areas, or like complications that you might have to face if you are working in a, for example, big US university or a big university in the Europe compared to that? Is there any like advantages of working in there or something like that?
So there are advantages. I think the main advantage to me is that there's very little competition, so it's much less competitive framework. The challenge is more to choose what to work on, because there's so much to do here, so many questions to address, so many interesting field sites to be focusing on, so many biodiversity issues, etc. So that's kind of the main challenge. But that's also very rewarding. I feel like whatever I'm doing, nobody else is doing it at the same time. So that would probably not be done if we were not here on the territory. I used to work in a big lab where we were, 15 people working on that one same species, and there were 3 other labs that were doing, like, really addressing similar questions. It did mean that the science probably was more advanced and was going faster and potentially more in depth than what we have a chance to do here, because we're a small team and we have fewer colleagues. But it also is more. I find it more interesting to some extent to feel like what I'm doing is not something that somebody else would have done necessarily. Yeah, so that's I guess a very positive aspect. Then you were talking about the difference with big universities in the US, etc. One issue we're facing too is that I think that's something you probably have whenever you become a PI anywhere in the world, but the admin load is pretty intensive here. We have a double layer because we're both depending on France and French Polynesia, and I'm working for a research institute that's being hosted by the university here. So I each time have all these 4 types of administrative load that are happening all together, which I'm also new to this system because I was out of the French system for a long time. So I need to get used to all the rules, all the acronyms everywhere, etc. So that's a challenge that maybe you don't face when you're in an American university.
Sure.
But maybe not really.
I think also on the same note, kind of, since you are working on such a remote area, how do you get your how do you recruit your PhD students and stuff like that? Like, are they mostly international, mostly French national? I mean, how does it work for you?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So I really have an ethic where one of my objectives being here in French Polynesia was to participate in helping local students to go through in science and in research. Also because I'm definitely convinced that if we are to help making a difference for the conservation of the local biodiversity. It has to go through the local community. So that's what we really aim for. So we're very happy to have our first Polynesian student this year, who's a great student, very good, very hard worker, and I'm sure he's going to do a great PhD. But otherwise, I don't really have a clear strategy. Like we have a second student that started this year. He did his master's with us a couple of years ago, and basically arrived with his own scholarship. I think because he really enjoyed the place, really enjoyed the fieldwork, and clearly there is question he can address here. We have these systems of multiple islands with different, invasion pathways, invasion history. So you have a lot of things you can investigate in an almost experimental framework. So that's really interesting to address many questions, and it's pretty unique as well. So we have lots of advantage with that regard. The big challenge is to attract students that are happy to be hosted in a little university far from everywhere, and they eventually can't really bring the family in either, but it's pretty fun.
Heng, you have a question, I think.
Yeah, I think just mentioned about scholarship is very interesting. Like, yeah, what kind of scholarship that the student can apply to go to work with you, because you're now in a very special place. You have a set to thanks funding, but how about the scholarship for the student?
Yeah, the way it works here, well, we got a scholarship from the local government, actually, for the local students to start with. It hasn't been easy, I won't deny it, and but we got very good support from the local government. Also because it's not that common. It's such a small place that there's not that many students that end up doing a PhD in ecology, right? It's not very usual. And then the other student we have, so he arrived with his own scholarship that his school in France is providing. With that unusual system in France, with some schools that are paying the students to study. It's really hard to get into these schools, but they're publicly funded, and once you get in there, you're paid for your studies, and you're also paid for your PhD. So you still need to write a good proposal, make sure that they're going to fund it, but you're almost guaranteed that you're going to get that funding at the end of it, and that's what we did. So that's a pretty good system. Otherwise, some grants from the university here, some scholarships from the university, very few. Yeah, they tend to be like one challenge I'm facing is that even if my research is a bit applied toward the conservation of biodiversity and restoration of habitats, there's way more applied sciences being conducted here as well, and that's more of a priority for the local government. And it's a very small university, and so we have one doctoral school that's giving a couple of scholarships every year, and they need to decide if they give it for a project in anthropology or in engineering or in ecology. It's a different selection process than the usual one.
I see. And how about your teaching? So you support to teach, and how is that? Whether it's support your research or whether it's like slow down your research?
Yeah, well, very luckily, I'm hardly teaching at all, actually, because I'm working as a researcher for that research institute, the IRD, so the French Institute for Research in Sustainable Development, meaning I don't have to teach. I'm teaching a little bit, but just very few hours, more to have a chance to train the student and show the students what kind of work we're doing here, and participate a bit in the activities of the university. But I don't have any teaching duties, so that really is very helpful as well to work on my research.
Yeah, but do you want to increase your teaching lot at some point?
It is a good question, actually. I'm not quite sure at this stage. Again, one of the challenges here that because of how small the university is, there's very few specialized training. So there will be general biology for the first few years of university, but that's about all there is. Like there is one master in ecology where there's only few hours that are given there, but it's mostly internship, mostly research projects. So there's not much space actually to teach at a level that I would be interested in. But that would be seen. It may change. But I think there's a bit fewer than 3,000 students, all included in that university, including students in law, students in geography, students in biology and physics and math, etc. So there's not a lot of teaching needed. Really.
Okay, thanks.
Going back to your research, like we have heard a lot during the conference about the importance of conservation and work with the local communities. Is it an area you have to work with, like working with the local communities? during your research?
Yeah, definitely. That's a very interesting question. I think that's something I was not so familiar with before getting here. And we started these projects, which are definitely fully collaborating with an NGO that's in charge of managing and restoring an entire ecosystem on an atoll, not far from Tahiti. And so we were really working closely with them. We were writing grants with them to help making progress in their restoration program. And we also are trying to work with small NGOs because we have all these islands in French Polynesia. One challenge is to get in touch with the local communities on every single island. So that takes a lot of time. We're taking profit of the fact that there are people that were there before us, especially from a local NGO that's based in Tahiti, but also is working on bird conservation everywhere in French Polynesia. A lot of the work they've done was to try to develop small groups locally on each island that are interested in the conservation of their environment. And some started their own NGOs. They're all small associations focused on the preservation of one bird species, for example. And so we're trying to work with them to develop both research projects, but also to do some capacity building, try to help them do some, develop protocols to count their birds and monitor them across time, things like that. So that's a very interesting interaction, and I think it's a big win-win. Like we really are learning a lot from these local communities, and I think that they also get access to training that they would not necessarily have if we were not here. So that's very interesting for us. But that's something we're trying to develop more and more. We've barely touched that aspect at this stage of these small.
Yeah, I guess most of the time they are happy to work with you, or do you face like negative feelings sometimes with people, with you doing research with people already there and maybe they don't want to share information, or I don't know.
Yeah, it varies actually. It varies. I'm definitely in that weird position where I've arrived in French Polynesia 3 years ago. So I'm very new here. I don't have any, I need to build my legitimacy here. I'm not legitimate as much as most people are here. And I need to prove myself as being worthy of their trust and of my interest in preserving their environments. And on top of that, there is a strong, very negative colonial history that happened here with the French colonizing the area and being still very impactful in everybody's mind. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind as well, to make sure that I'm not, stepping out of my where I'm supposed to, basically. So that's a challenge, something I try to keep in mind all the time, but I'm also very well aware of it. And so in most cases, it hasn't been a big issue, especially for the small local NGO. I've had the feeling that most people are really happy to hear that there is some interest for their specific islands, because they're very proud of their birds, they're very proud of their environment, and very happy to see that it's attracting the attention of others around. It's been more of a challenge maybe for bigger organizations that have been there for 20 years and that clearly know the field much better than I do, and that we do in the lab here. And in that case, we haven't managed to run so many projects together yet, but there is hope. I think it's all about showing that we really care, and in a few years potentially they'll be convinced that we can work together to build some interesting projects. But I think you just need to let the time help with that too.
Yeah, I think Brian, you have a question.
Yes. So I mean, this question is from the YouTube chat by David, and also I had a similar question. Since you're talking about your research, so you work with both birds and crabs, and it, according to David, is like also a curious mix. So like, what is the overlap between them, and how did you end up working with those like two particular species that might not always like work together or like interact together?
Yeah, excellent question. Excellent question. I hope I'll answer that question during my plenary. Basically, the main reason why I'm focused on birds, initially, I was really imagining working on terrestrial birds here, because they are the group that are at the highest risk of extinction. There's about 20 species in French Polynesia of terrestrial bird that are either endangered or critically endangered. So that's really the group I thought I would focus the most on. And in the end, I've been working way more on seabirds and terrestrial crabs. I realized that one thing that's really interesting and that we locally are not focusing on enough is that it's not just conserving a species that matters, but also preserving entire ecosystems and their functioning. And on these atolls, on these remote atolls, you really have two groups of species that are super important, which are the seabirds and the land crabs. So in these remote areas that are so far away from any continents, mammals never made it there. We're too far from South America, too far from Australia. So we don't even have a bat species here. There is one in Hawaii, for example, but they did not make it here. So any mammal that we found on land here has been brought in by humans. And the consequence of that is all the ecosystem functions that usually mammals are in charge of are being taken care of by crabs, by lots of terrestrial crabs. And the seabirds are really important because in these ecosystems, they are very poor in nutrients. They're bringing, via the guano, they're fertilizing the systems. So by understanding these two groups of species, it's way easier to understand how the whole ecosystem is affected by changes, by invasive species, especially in my case, in the case of my key problematic. So I don't know if I responded to your question. The other response is just that crabs and seabirds are really cool, and that's just enough, you know, justify working with these guys.
I think you have a question. Your micro.
Okay. I think Simon mentioned about, yeah, he want to keep some the research question maybe for the plenary one, but I think it's nice. So I think maybe I asked a question about the career. I think starting a lab is not an easy job. So how it look like in your first 2 months when you landed there? How you coordinate everything?
So the first 2 months I landed here, I arrived here during COVID. So the first 2 weeks, when arriving here, they just put me on a bus at the airport. I had no idea where they were taking me. And it was at night. And after an hour and a half on the bus, they dropped us in a room. And I spent the next 2 weeks in that room. So that's how it happened at the very beginning. There was a quarantine during COVID. But it was a nice spot in terms of having access to the outdoor. There was a big yard around where we could go. And that's where I started, basically, because there was not much to do there. We started birds and learning to identify the birds that were around and understand the different species, identify their call, etc. So that was a good way to start. And from there on, we really started by, so I'm working with my wife, right? So we're working together on the same questions. We really had the same working on the same subjects. And so we started that there, and then we just realized that since we didn't have a place to live yet, it might be the good time to just travel around from island to island, do some bird surveys, and start discovering the place as well at the same time, since we didn't know it at all. We did that for about 3 or 4 months, if I remember well. And that was before even applying for grants and stuff. After that, we settled down and started writing grants to get back and be able to keep going.
You just mentioned that you travel from island to island to find a place to see that where you want to live, and then how is the logistic there?
Yeah, it was not so much to see where I wanted to live, but more about understanding what the different islands look like and what kind of research we could conduct around. It's way easier once you've seen the field sites to understand what you can do there. And so yeah, that was more about that. And it was more, right now we don't have any funding for research, but if we're not paying a rent, maybe we can afford to travel around without having to pay for that rent.
Okay, right.
Obayan?
Yeah, on the kind of same note, so when you talked about why you are choosing birds and crabs, it kind of sounded like, correct me if I'm wrong, this was not your essentially initial plan to look what you are currently studying. And also, since you are moving to such a remote area, obviously you don't have many options. So, like, what was your backup plan in case the work that you initially planned is not going, like, did not happen? I mean, I guess that you obviously had like a much more concrete plan than we can think of. But like, was your backup plan, or like, what is the importance of having backup plans in terms of like when you're starting as a new PI and stuff like that? Would you like to put any perspective on that?
Yeah, for me specifically, I had multiple projects in mind already, so I didn't really have a backup plan. I just did not know exactly what project I would start with. And as I arrived here, I heard about that rat eradication program that was happening, and I got contacted by colleagues even before arriving about the need for more research around that program. So that just got added to my research plan just before arriving here. But that's not something I'd written in my research proposal originally. So I've done part of what was written in that proposal, but I've also added more stuff. I focused a lot on this eradication for that reason. But I could definitely have kept going with my initial plan, I think, which I have to some extent. In terms of backup plan and advice that I could give, one thing that I found very useful to me as a postdoc before was running comparative analysis. This is something that doesn't require any funding except for your salary. And something you can do when you're unemployed as well without any salary. So that's really something that was very rewarding as well in terms of the level of the journals in which you can submit some of these papers, because you're working on a much broader scale and you can draw more general patterns, etc. I don't necessarily think that it's more valuable as a research, but it's more valuable from the people, from the point of view of people who may hire you or give you grants. So that's something that was very useful for me, and that's something that you can really do anywhere once you have, once you can just survive yourself and make a living out of anything. You can still do comparative analysis, even if you don't have money for fieldwork or lab work.
I have a very broad question for you. Just go back in the past, and when you were a postdoc and you say, okay, let's find a job, like how long did it take to you find something? Was it easy or?
Oh yeah, it was super easy. It only took me 9 years as a postdoc to get a permanent job.
Whoops.
No, I spent a long time before getting a job, but I went through different steps during that time. So I had 9 years of postdoc, and I started applying for permanent jobs, I think after 3 years. But I just did that for 2 years, and then I stopped for 4 years because I got a 4-year postdoc funded. So I just focused on that research and did not really focus so much on finding a more permanent job. The time I really spent a lot of the period during my career during which I spent a lot of time trying to find a more permanent job or even switching to a different career path was during the last couple of years before getting this PI position. And I know that for the last 6 months, well, there's been a period of 6 months during which I applied for 30 different positions, and I got a few interviews. I got this permanent job and another postdoc basically out of these 30 applications. One thing that I really saw as my career advanced was that so I started by writing my own grant to get a postdoc, which I think as a young researcher is very, very useful to show that you're able to get money, but also to write your own project. And I was also lucky to get one. I think it's a bit easier when you're a very young researcher because there's more grants that are available specifically for young researchers. That might be a bit less competitive as well. It's less focused on how many papers you have, more focused on the quality of your project. But then I mostly applied to postdocs that were already funded. So basically sent my CV to researchers that had money to fund a postdoc. And eventually when I started applying for jobs, that was a moment where I was not eligible to most of the postdoc grants anymore. Because the only way for me to get this postdoc was to find somebody who already had money and was allowed to hire even an old postdoc. So yeah, it's been a long path, but I wasn't too focused on getting a permanent job so much until pretty much the end of these 9 years of postdoc.
And when you were applying for this permanent job, like, did you have feedback, and would you have advice for people, like for young researchers trying to find job like you were trying to find one?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the right person to give advice on these things. I wouldn't say that my experience has been so detailed. I haven't been very good at getting feedback either. I know some people would definitely go and ask more questions to the jury, etc., which I haven't done much. So I don't know exactly what happens. I've already had feedback from, a third person that would know of someone who was in the jury, etc. From the experience I've had, a lot of it is luck. Luck is playing a big part. We tend to spend a lot of time on the written part of your project to show how solid your project is and how good your CV is, etc. And I think in the end, this is not as important as it sounds. And a lot of what seems to be important is how good you are doing at least in the French system, usually they're very short interviews. It's very different from a university in the US or in Canada, where you may spend 2 full days being there at the university, giving seminars, interacting with everybody. Here in France, you just end up having a 10 to 15 minutes presentation, 5 minutes of questions, and that's it. This is over. So it's very brief. So you need to be pretty much perfect during that time. You need to convince everybody of how good you are, how clever you are, and also how humble you are at the same time, so that the jury does not feel offended by anything you may say during it. So it's a very challenging thing, and it's always a competition too. So it depends on who else is around, who is in your jury, what they care about. So that's I don't think that I'm very helpful here. Probably just saying things that you're already aware of, but I feel like potentially at some point, what makes a difference is not so much the science or your background. It's really how chatty you are and how good you are at selling your projects more than anything. And there's a big part of that as well. Yeah.
Well, Sang, you have a question?
Yeah. So I think someone also specifically mentioned about funding for early career researchers. And because you just have your new lab, and maybe you realize that you have no access to the funding for young PI anymore, even though you just established your lab, what it look like at the moment. So because I think it's very different from field to field, but the idea is they currently cap several years, for example, 4 or 5 years for the young PI to apply for the startup grant. So it's very important how you see that and whether we should improve that situation.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood your question again, whether we should improve the situation of changing these grants that are only available to young researchers. Yeah, I think the solution for that is just to make researchers more permanent and stop funding research on these very projects. That's the only thing I can think of. That would also be a good way to improve, I think, the quality of research. That would not be focused on a project, but focused on a really long-term project. And that's how I research in general. Really, that's not the direction it's taking, including the funds where we're going for more and more temporary positions. I think that we're wrong there. So we really need to make a position.
I think you mentioned about funding for early career researcher, but I think there's some funders, they have funding for early PI. For example, the PI just established a lab within 5 years, they get eligible. But most of the PI in certain field, after they establish the first lab, they are not all past the early career phase already. They cannot apply for the staff grant for the early career anymore. And then for the mid career funding, it's too much for the aim. So how it look like? In that situation,
That's a challenge. They're not.
And I think at some point you mentioned that you were maybe thinking about a non-academic position. Well, what kind of alternate career you were thinking of at some point, like before having this job?
At some point, I started applying for jobs in NGOs, both big international NGOs like the IUCN or BirdLife International, and smaller local ones. Like I applied for a job with the Mauritius Wildlife Conservation Foundation. And that was a moment where basically I was struggling to get another job. And I realized that I was an old postdoc. There was potentially a moment where maybe I should make a decision with what I wanted to do with my career in the future. So, and I felt like these jobs would be really interesting in any case. And even these, even if it's out of the academia, these NGOs have very strong scientists that are really interested in conducting very interesting science in general. So I was hoping to have these type of position. It didn't work. It didn't work at all for me. I don't really have I shouldn't say it didn't work. It worked for this Mauritius Wildlife Foundation. I ended up not taking the job for personal reason. I was not ready to move there yet at that stage, just for personal reason. But it didn't work for the IUCN, BirdLife, etc. But I don't really have an advice on how to move towards these areas in a different career path.
I guess you had a lot of Google research to find this kind of job, because like it's very like everywhere. The job announcements you can find. Yeah,
it's true. I was specifically following a few forums I knew of, like there's a French Society of Ecology, the SFE, that provides like just is listing some of these jobs, but I was also following directly what was going on with the IUCN and with BirdLife, because I've been working on their data a lot for my comparative analysis. So I was really aware of what they were doing and found it very interesting as well. but I didn't have a very clear and good strategy on where exactly to look for a job. Eventually, I got a more specific strategy of where to look for a permanent job, permanent position. I was more picky with that, but with regard to these temporary jobs, I was not very strategic. I was really just at some point looking for something.
So thank you. It's quite the end of the question period. Thank you, Simon, for this Meet the PI session. We will see you soon in the third session of the day for your plenary talk. And we are very excited to see about what you are working. And yeah. So see you soon. And I hope people will follow and join us to the next session. Thanks a lot, Simon, again.
Thank you. Very nice talking to you guys. Thank you.
Bye.
And see you soon.